Today, we will be starting our second segment on our mini health series. In our previous episode, we discussed mental health in depth. Today, we will be going over to the topic on everybody's lips, that of abortion laws and obviously the groundbreaking case, that of Roe v. Wade.
Roe v. Wade case caused a lot of issues in a lot of people's lives, be that in a good way, finally we're being heard, or be that in a very controversial way of, okay, so now we don't have a say on our bodies, etc. Like it's pretty broad. And I think for a second episode on health, again, just touching base on a very broad field, this would be an awesome way for us to wrap up our mini series, our mini quarter on health.
My name is Brendan Llewellyn.
My name is Llewellyn, and this is Finding Borders.
Roll intro.
So kick us off, Mr. Legal Man. I understand you are a student of the law in South Africa. What can you tell us about your findings on abortion?
Well, yes, I'm now a third year student in law over here. And actually in my second year, I quite went in depth with abortion law and the nasciturousid age, which is the unborn fetus and so forth. And I think definitely today we'll be discussing not just South African perspective, but obviously the Roe v. Wade case. But before we can get started on Roe v. Wade, I think it'd be good to give some historical background and context to abortion laws in general in the United States. Now, if we dial back the clock a bit, we can see that in the earliest of, I think, 19th, 20th century, which happened was the first state was Connecticut, which completely criminalized abortion for anyone who was administering poison and also taking poison for methods of abortion. So Connecticut was the first state. Later, I think it was in 1967, in which Colorado was the first state to completely decriminalize abortion, but only to be used for the purposes of like a medical issue, or the fetus was in danger if it was by virtue of rape or like incest. And obviously, 1973, which I'll give over the mic to you now to give us some more in-depth context on the case, which was Roe v. Wade.
With Roe v. Wade, abortion back then in Texas, which is where Norma McCorvey, who's known as Jane Roe, abortion was illegal in Texas unless, like you just said, it was to save the mother's life. There's a complication and you can't have an emergency cesarean section, C-section, to remove the fetus to save both their lives in an attempt. So to make a very clear standing on this, Jane Roe in this case, became pregnant with her third child. This was in 1969. Now, they wished to not have a third child for reasons unknown. As their choice. They didn't want a third child. And they wanted an abortion, which is in Texas, which was illegal back in 1969. Basically, what had happened was Jane Roe, AKA Norma McCorvey, sued the district attorney, Henry Wade, hence Roe v. Wade. It was a special 3-judge court of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas. And they heard the case and ruled in her favor 7-2. So on January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court issued a 7-2 decision. It was that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which provides a fundamental right to privacy. Now, on the 24th of June, 2022, the Supreme Court overruled Roe in a Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization on the grounds that the substantive right to abortion was not deeply rooted in this nation's history or tradition. Now, those are quotations. So what happened with Dobbs, which is essentially what overruled the Roe v. Wade case and the precedent that established in abortion cases, it was triggered by a Mississippi law that banned abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Now, the Supreme Court is made up of 6 conservative judges, and only 3 of them are liberals. And these judges are appointed to the Supreme Court for life. Like, the only way you're getting out of the Supreme Court in the US is if you either A, retire, or B, die. Like, that is as simple as it is. But obviously you are nominated by the president, you're employed by the president, who in this case is Joe Biden. But it's not really the only controversial case. Like, I will say that there was a few other cases. So one in 1952 was Brown v. the Board of Education, which deemed segregated schools to be unconstitutional. And then you had Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which ruled that laws banning interracial marriages were unconstitutional. And later, you had Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which ruled that blocking same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. And all of these were centered around the 14th Amendment and the right to privacy. So that 14th Amendment right, which is the right to privacy, seems really key in this case, as to the fact that if you don't have the ability to make decisions with your body, you're essentially stripped of your privacy. Like, what do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, definitely, man. I think there was a lot of legal academics in the United States that wrote many, many papers afterwards, which thoroughly discussed like that women born 10 to 20 years ago have much less rights now that women had, well, 40 to 50 years before that. And I find we also have to look at some of the groundbreaking strides it made for, well, pro-abortionists after the Roe v. Wade case initially ruling back in 1973. We can look at some of the legislation passed by Bill Clinton, which I believe was called Free Access to Health Clinics Act, in which he ruled that you could not obstruct the entrance of any abortion clinics or any clinical things giving, well, any abortion services. And also you have to look in 2018, which was another groundbreaking case, which was called the Women's Health versus Hellerstedt, which basically the final decision ruled that Texas couldn't place restrictions on abortion services, and they could not create any undue burden for women who wanted to get an abortion. So there were a lot of positives and negatives. It truly only is up to you in which side of the spectrum you are on.
But like,
moving away from the United States, we can now take a look at some other countries and other continents' rules and regulations, laws, ruling over abortion laws. For example, I think we'll start with our home country, which is South Africa. Now, South Africa, there are very few restrictions placed on abortions, and you can get an abortion up to 13 weeks of pregnancy in South Africa. In between 13 to 20 weeks of pregnancy, it has to be under very specific or really specific conditions, which can pertain to maybe your fetus is in trouble or it will cost your own life. If it's for some sort of medical implication, you can actually get an abortion for over 13 to 20 weeks. Now, if you take a look back at the United States, some of the states after the Roe v. Wade case was overturned, I think it's now about to 8 states which has essentially criminalized abortion. And I think up to 1 state specifically ruled up to you cannot get an abortion. You can only get an abortion up to 6 weeks of pregnancy, which the majority of pregnant women in the United States don't even know they're pregnant yet. So, which is quite controversial. We can also take a look at Australia's also really made strides in decriminalizing abortion over the years.
Western Australia places abortion under criminal code. South Australia, which we have spoken about before in a previous episode about load shedding, has been the most recent state to actually decriminalize abortion, with the changes starting on the 7th of July this year. So it's already been decriminalized. in saying that. The limits on like your surgical abortions, they vary from 16 weeks in the Australian Capital Territory or Canberra to 24 weeks in Victoria, which is neighbouring New South Wales, before any further approvals are needed. I find we're actually quite privileged now in the 21st century to be living in a world where we have all these options for contraception to, up to 99.999 to the last decimal percent to prevent unwanted pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy, as they call it. I mean, for instance, men have condoms. Okay, that's one measure. Yeah, they even have internal condoms nowadays. Like you can have one that does the exact same thing, but for the women. You have the contraceptive pill that's been around for a few years now, at least. You have your copper IUD. So look, there's actually a lot more options to prevent unplanned pregnancy nowadays. It's just a matter of, is that enough? And is it still important to have the choice should any of these measures fail, as they have? Because I just mentioned you have a 99.99 to the last decimal chance of it not happening, unplanned pregnancy. It does still happen. So yeah, look, I honestly think in this topic and in this conversation and in this direction we've taken, we have not made the slightest dent to alter the course of these macro decisions. Like, I just felt that it is important we address it and give our 2 cents on the matter. And for those in need, hopefully come across this episode and might walk away with something more, might already hear something they've already heard and they know absolutely nothing afterwards. But I just feel like I'm willing to take that chance. And I think on that bombshell, it is time for us to end. And I would like to give a very short introduction, more of a teaser really, into our next topic, which will be travel.
Thank you, and tune in next week as we start our second, third, fourth, I don't know which quarter we're on even more. Just stay in and stay tuned.